Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah to all of you, and welcome to our session on the Fusus Al Hikam. And we begin the third chapter of the Fusus Al Hikam, which is quite extraordinary. How many lessons did we spend on the first two chapters? Like maybe, what, like 30, I think? Extraordinary. So we are now going to start this third chapter. Can all of you see the text?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, whoops. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read the first paragraph and the title, please? A volunteer, please. Otherwise, I'll do it. So let's get started then. Bismillah. Okay. فص حكمة سبحية في كلمات نوحية. Right. اعلم أن التنزيه عند أهل الحقائق في الجانب الإلهية عين التحديد والتقييد. Right. فالمنزه إما جاهل وإما صاحب سوء أدب، ولكن إذا أطلقه ولكن إذا أطلقه وقال به فالقائل بالشرعية، والمؤمن إذا نزه ووقف عند التنزيه ولم يرى غير ذلك فقد أساء الأدب وأكذب الحق والرسول صلوات الله عليهم، وهو لا يشعر ويتخيل أنه في الحاصل وهو في الفائت، وهو كمان آمن ببعض وكفر ببعض، ولا سيما or I should say ولا سيما، وقد علم أن ألسنة الشرعية الإلهية إذا نطقت في الحق تعالى بما نطقت به إنما جاءت به في العموم على المفهوم الأول وعلى خصوص على كل مفهوم يفهم من وجوه ذلك اللفظ بأي لسان كان في وضع ذلك اللسان. That's the first paragraph. We certainly won't go further than that. So, if you recall that the first fuss was about the wisdom of divinity, and then the second fuss is about the wisdom of this nephathia, this breathing, right? The correlation is that each fuss also corresponds to what you might call a cosmological stage, a stage in the cosmos, and in the stage of cosmogenesis. So, for example, the first fuss corresponds to the level of the ahadiyya, Allah's utter oneness and uniqueness and incomparability. And then the second fuss is when you have the nafas al-Rahman. It corresponds to the level of God's nafas al-Rahman when he breathes out the nafas and the things come into existence, which corresponds to the number of the chapters. Because chapter 1, number 1, is not the first number in the Arabic language, because 1 is not a number. It's the principle of all numbers, right? No creation can come out of number 1. The second chapter, number 2, is when creation, properly speaking, begins, and you get duality, right? But from duality, number 2, creation does not enter into existence, because there has to be something to bring it together, right? So that's why in chapter 3, creation, properly speaking, begins and it comes into wujud. And so there's a secret with the number 3, right? Because if you look at the order of the chapters, Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam and Sayyidina Sheeth, the one who should come next is Sayyidina Idris, chronologically speaking, but it's not. He puts Nuh first, alayhi salam, then he puts Sayyidina Idris, alayhi salam. And there's a reason for that. Because the number 3 corresponds to this chapter, because it is the first odd number. And the first odd number is what begins existence, properly speaking. It is the odd number. It's the first odd number. It is the number of fardiyya, right? Now, what you're going to see is that this fuss has a close correspondence with fuss Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the reason there's a connection between those two is because the name of the fuss in fuss Muhammad is fuss hikmatin. What is it? It is, I believe, fardiyya. In the same way that Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, he is the first of the messengers. Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he's the last of the messengers. And so there is a cyclical symmetry between the two. Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, he opens the risala, and Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he closes the risala. Right? So if the second chapter corresponds to the level cosmologically of the Nafs al-Rahman, the breath of the All-Merciful that brings things into existence, this level corresponds to the intellect, the world of the spirits, alam al-arwah. So if I say intellect and I say spirits, so you may not be aware of this, so I'll spell it out. In the Islamic tradition, intellect and spirit are almost synonymous. There are two different perspectives for viewing the same phenomena. What we call intellect today is not what they called intellect in the past. What we call intelligence today is a very small reflection. It's a shadow of the actual intellect that is luminous, nurani. It is spiritual. And having what's called dhaka in Arabic, being dhaki, clever, is just a small reflection of being spiritually intelligent. That's why spiritual intelligence and the angels go hand in hand. So the world of the intellect is the world of the spirits, is the world of the angels. And this is the level that corresponds to the martaba, the degree of Sayyid Nuh alayhi salam. He has a sympathy closest to that cosmological degree, which is why he has the hal, the state of the angels. What is the state of the angels? What is their hal? The state of the angels. All right, let me do this. Okay. The state of the angels is that they do not reflect variegation. They're constant. They're constant in their love. They're shadid. They're fierce in their love for their Lord. And they're not flexible in it. So they are intensely jealous for his sake. So that's why Shaykh al-Akbar, he talks about this in another chapter in the Futuhat, when he says, look at the state between the Khalifa and the state between the angel. Rasulullah, he had the state of the Khalifa. Sometimes he does this, sometimes he does that. And he is constantly in variegation, moving with the flow, moving with the Tao, if you like. Sometimes he forgives, sometimes he punishes. Sometimes he has mercy on someone, sometimes he is stringent, right? And sometimes he does this, sometimes he does that. If there is a verse that's revealed about a munafiq that says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not forgive this munafiq even if you're to pray for him more than 70 times, the answer is that I will pray for more than 70 times. Even if you prayed 70, but there's nishara, I'll pray for more than 70 times, right? And so on and so forth. The state of the angels is not like that. The angels seek your forgiveness on earth. But once you incur their wrath, that's it. That is done. How is that relevant to this story of Sayyid Nuh alayhi salam, right? And we'll go through a story. Because what this chapter is about is it's just a tafsir. I use that word not lightly. It's basically a tafsir of Surah Nuh, which is what? Surah 71 of the Quran, right? So how does that relate to Sayyid Nuh alayhi salam? He calls his people to God and away from their idolatry for a long time. How long does he call them for?
$900 or something like that.
Okay, the number in the Quran is 950. That's the one you're referring to. But
950.
if unless I mean, but someone needs to double check this. So the way it's written in the Quran is 1000 minus 50. But that is how long he lived. There are Jewish commentaries on the same story, so it doesn't say that that's how long he called them for. He called them for about 300 years, according to Jewish traditions. Whichever way you look at it, it doesn't really matter that much. But I'm gonna go with the Jewish version. So he called them for 300 years, right? Even though he lived for 950. And 300 years is a very long time. So it requires patience that's beyond our imagination. But once his patience runs out, it's done. He calls upon God's wrath, his ghadab on his qawm, and it's done. That's it. And you'll see that in the surah. When he makes a dua against them, it's done. It's finished. That's different to the hal of Sayyidina Muhammad. His wrath is not once and for all once you incur his wrath. He may forgive you, he may not. Because his ahwal moves and changes according to the coloration of the circumstances. He's colored by the circumstances, which is why insan kamil, and Sayyidina Nuh, he is insan kamil. He is insan kamil. But the hal of the insan kamil is he's compared to a chameleon. You must have heard this from Sayyidina Ali, right? Sayyidina Ali Hussein. I think according to our modern understanding of how a chameleon functions, the chameleon changes its temperature in order to change the color of its body. But the way they saw it in the past is like if it moves into a patch of green, it goes green, moves into a patch of red, it turns red. So it takes on the color of its surroundings, which means it takes the insan camel takes on the hal of whatever the situation requires of him, right? So the hal of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam is comparable to the hal of the angels, according to this martaba, right? Now, this is a majestic fuss. It is a truly grand and majestic chapter of the Fusus Al Hikam. It is also a chapter of what? Hayra. You will be delighted to know, since you've come across this word many times. What's Hayra in English? It's perplexity, right? And bewilderment. Perplexity and bewilderment. It is a chapter that will not only confuse you, it is designed to confuse you, and it moves very fast, and it will take you in a whirlwind spin, and it's supposed to do that. Because when authors of the past, the ones who are masters of their craft, when they write something, they don't just write about it, they write in the form of their subject matter. So the subject matter of this chapter is Hira, and so he will also confuse you while writing about Hira. Yeah. So we all know the story of Sayyid Nuh alayhi salam, right? Because the chapter depends on us knowing the story. If anyone doesn't know it, let me know. Like we can do something about it later on, right? But there's basically 4 levels. Well, no one talks about this, so this is just my opinion. So you see, you're clear on this. The way I view this chapter is that there are 4 levels in which this chapter can be read. You can read this chapter on 4 levels, 4 ways. There is a macrocosmic reading where you see this chapter in terms of the cosmos and its cosmogenesis. Then there's a second reading, which is the microcosmic reading. You read this chapter in terms of your own soul, right? The dark night of the soul. What happens when the soul reaches its enlightenment and it is drowning in the waters of Ma'arafah, right? The people of Nuh alayhi salam drown, right? If you take the symbolic microcosmic reading, so you can have a symbolic reading in 2 ways, macrocosmic and microcosmic, but symbolic in either way. So if you read microcosmically, the people of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam represent the intellect that's corrupted. And the waters that drown them are the waters of knowledge, right? And so the intellect cannot survive the waters of knowledge, it just drowns. And then the Safinat Nuh alayhi salam, the Safinat Nuh is the heart. The heart is what floats above the waters of Ma'rifah, right? And you can read the rest of the chapter that way. Then there's a third way to read this chapter, which is just a literal reading. That's the one I prefer. Because what some commentators I notice do is they read the chapter partly literally, but when it comes to the difficult parts, they reinterpret it microcosmically. My preference is to read the chapter literally all the way throughout. And there are difficult parts. If you don't believe me, I will quote you a commentator from the Fusus Al Hikam, Tim Sani, and I'll show you his own words, where he says some of this stuff is actually really tough. When he says tough, he doesn't mean he's not smart enough to get it. He's very smart. It just means the implications are hard to grasp. And you will see why eventually as we go on throughout this fuss. The implications of this fuss are actually quite radical. It is what sparked the anger and the fury of Ibn Taymiyyah, amongst other chapters. So this is one of them. Then there's a fourth level, which I also read as well. And it is the mythological level. And what you're going to see, because if you remember the story of Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, it's a story of conflict, right? Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam against his people, right? And they are in conflict with each other. And if you read the surah is a very intense one. Surah 71. It moves very fast. It moves very intensely. And it is a conflict where the disagreement between both sides just increases, and just gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you come to the final tragic conclusion, right? So the mythological level, the last way to read this as far as I could tell, is in terms of the divine names. The battle between Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam and his people is the battle between two divine names, al-Zahir and al-Batin, which if you read Homer and the Iliad, the battle between gods, that's called a theomachy. So this is a kind of a theomachy between the divine names, right? And if that makes you ask the question, but wait a minute, like how can there be a conflict between divine names? Because God is one and Allah is one, right? But that's with respect to his essence. But his names are many. And so there is a conflict between the names. And the Shaykh Al-Akbar will point this out again and again. You'll come across it in the Sufi Path of Knowledge. You will come across it in this chapter as well. You will say explicitly in the Futuhat, he will say, what does the name Al-Rafi' have to do with Al-Mudhil, for example? What does Ar-Rahman have to do with Shadid Al-Iqab? Right? And the names, each name demands the manifestation of its own effects. So what does that mean? Like, can you have mercy and be wrathful against an entity, an Ayn Thabita, at the same time? You can't. They cancel out their effects. So there's a musara, there's a wrestling between them, between the names, that gets resolved in the divine essence, which is why we have number 3. Because 2 is for the names that conflict with each other, and the number 3 symbolizes their resolution, right? Duality that gets resolved when they are synthesized together. And we'll come across this theme as well as we go throughout the chapter, right? And I'm going to take it quite slow, actually, because that's the only way to take this chapter. Are there any questions so far? No questions? Okay. So let's go through the title of the chapter. فص حكمة سبحية في كلمات نوحية. What does subahiyya mean? What is that word from? And I want to encourage like a little bit of an interaction before we get into the meat of the text itself.
SubhanAllah, exaltation.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And so what you get. Exactly. So you get verses in the Quran like سبح اسم ربك الأعلى, right? And so on and so forth. And then you have this dua, سبوح قدوس رب الملائكة والروح. That's what you say in your sujood. It's a dua you say in your sujood in the salat. So it means to glorify something, right? سبح اسم ربك الأعلى, right? Glorify the name of your highest Lord, right? So subahiyya means exaltation and praise. But so one of the meanings of it is maddah, to praise something, right? But another one of its meanings is what? Tanzih. What's tanzih? What is tanzih?
يعني يترفع عن الشيء, which is raising above the situation.
Yeah, but tanzih is tathir. Tanzih is tathir. Yeah, go ahead, Hannah.
Oh, I don't know. I haven't a clue now. Anyway, is it expansion?
No.
I can't remember.
That'd be something else.
Yeah.
So tanzih is tathir, which is purification. It is purification. And the opposite of tanzih is tashbih. And students of kalam will know what tanzih and tashbih are, because they're extremely important words in kalam, right? So tanzih is to purify something, and it's connected to exaltation and glorification, because when you glorify something, you want to raise its level, right? You want to raise its value. You do that by removing from it the things you think aren't appropriate to it. And that's where you get the conflict between many religious people, right? Because many religious people will believe in a God that's different to their own God. And then they will say something like, the God you believe in, he has attributes that aren't appropriate to God, the one that I believe in. So I'm going to remove them, right? Right? That's glorification. You're glorifying your own Lord, your own God. When you say what you believe in is not appropriate. And then the other person says, what you believe in is not appropriate for me, right? So to glorify something is to remove from it anything you deem to be an imperfection. To glorify something like a God, your Lord, is to remove from it anything you deem to be an imperfection. Therefore you've elevated it and you've exalted it. And that's why it's also connected to, in the dua, Subuhun Qudusun, Rabb al-Malaikatu Ruh, right? Subuhun Qudusun. The next chapter is about the Hikmatan Qudusiyya, في كلمات إدريسية, right? So Subahiyya is connected to Qudusiyya, which means making something holy. You've made it holy when you exalted your understanding of God. Really, what you're doing is exalting your understanding of God. When you exalt God, you're exalting a certain understanding of God, which is your understanding, and you've made it holy. Now, in Jewish, it's also connected to kadosh and qudus. Kadosh is to set it apart, which is a good way of looking at the Arabic as well. You set it apart, stand aside, right? So I like to use this image. If you're in a household and you have plateware, different plates, different vessels, if you've got like a very special item, you set it apart. Maybe you raise it above the others. Maybe you set it apart from the others, so that when we look at it, at that part of the house, we know it's a special item because you set it apart. That is glorification. You have set it apart from the other things, right? And of course, the easiest way to glorify God is to say he's not like his creation. That's tanzih. So another way to translate, well, one translation of tanzih is transcendence. He transcends his creation. But a second translation is incomparability. You cannot compare God with his own creation. If you do so, you are attributing attributes of imperfection to God. And that's not right. This is the act of subuhiyya, right? It's opposite. So before I come to the opposite, so now we get into the duality, right? We're already into the first duality before we've even begun the fuss. Tanzih and tashbih. Tanzih is to purify something and make it incomparable. So you're saying God is not comparable to his creation. So that is the act of negation. So you express God in negative terms, right? He is not this and not that. He is not this person. He is not that person. He's not like this thing. He's not like that thing, right? Sidi Bukhari, what is transcendence in Tanzih? It's to transcend your creation. You are not like them. You are beyond them, beyond anything that can be imagined about God, which is the proper understanding of him. So one of the awliya said, anything that comes to your mind, God is apart from that. He's not that. Whatever comes to your mind about God, he is not that. That is called tanzih. That is purification. And that is expressing him in negative terms. So that's called negative theology, which is very popular in Islam and Christianity. Christianity has its own negative apophatic theology of the God that transcends our understanding. That's always the correct starting point with God. The correct starting point with God is we do not know him by ourselves. We do not know him by ourselves. We do not understand him by ourselves. And that's why you get certain discussions later on about, can you love God? Because how can you love something you can't comprehend? And so on and so forth, right? This is tanzih. Tashbih is the opposite. Tashbih is the opposite. Tashbih means similarity. This is also another theological word. It gives the mutakallimun some trouble. Maybe not all of them, I can't generalize, but I'm pretty sure it gives some of them trouble. Why does tashbih give some of the mutakallimun trouble?
I'm assuming there's Go ahead.
Sorry, Hannah.
I think somebody else wanted to say something. I'll let them go.
All right, sure.
Yeah, I was going to say because they find it problematic that they think that people think that something could be comparable to God or God could be comparable to something. It's as if you're reducing God or like committing shirk or something.
Yeah, but you know what? If it's not a revelation, it's not a problem. We just tell the other person to get lost and goodbye if it's not a revelation. So to add to what you're saying, Maham, there is a problem. The problem is that tashbih is in revelation. And that creates a conundrum. Tashbih exists in revelation. So does tanzih, obviously. Tanzih is the starting point. So in the Quran, what you get as an example of tanzih is like Subhanallah amma yasifun. Glory be to him. He's way beyond what they describe him. From the whims of their own imaginings. He's way beyond that. Subhanallah amma yushrikun. He's way beyond what they associate with him. And the partners that they give him. He's way beyond that. He's way bigger than that. He doesn't need them. There's lots of tanzih in the Quran. But you also get tashbih. Istawa ala arsh, for example, right? He sits on the throne. And the Hadith Qudsi, he does something called harwala. What's harwala? It's jogging. If my servant comes to me walking, I jog to him, right? He says, taht ayuna, before our eyes. He says with his hands, Eid Allah fawq aydihim. His hand is over their hands, right?
Can I ask a question here? Sorry.
Yeah, Allah laughs. In the hadith, he laughs. He smiles. This is all tashbih. Yeah, go ahead.
So what's the difference between tashbih and isti'ara?
That's a good question.
It's metaphor, and tashbih in English, if I want to translate it, it means, I don't know.
Tashbih means similarity.
similarity. And like استوى على العرش, it's a metaphor, but it doesn't mean it's similarity, no?
Aha. Aha. This is the question of the mutakallimun that they've debated
So
for hundreds of years.
when you speak about mutakallimun are the people who are trying to explain or understand or...
Yeah. They're called the rational theologians. The rational theologians. They are the people who wrestle with the tough questions. So one of the tough questions is what we're doing right now. When God describes himself with tashbih in the Quran, what does that mean? Right? But they use tools of rationality plus revelation to come to an answer. And they're called, it's a discipline. The same way you have fuqaha who deal with fiqh, you have mutakallimun who deal with kalam. Kalam is a subject, it's a discipline, but it's a rational discipline that deals with creedal matters of aqidah. So the subject matter of kalam is aqidah, okay? That is what they do, yes. That is what they do. So they're trying to answer these questions. For example, another question they wrestle with is like, do human beings have free will or not? Yes or no? Mu'tazila say yes, they do, right? The Ash'aris say no, they don't. For example, and there's many questions they answer. There are many questions they wrestle with. This is one of them. Tashbih and tanzih, right? How do we understand God's tashbih in the Quran? So God, one of the things you said was that his sitting on the throne is a metaphor, but that's the question they're asking, right? And I mean, to cut a long story short, this is a great question. It's not, I would say it's not isti'ara. Because if you call it isti'ara, if you're saying it's a pure metaphor, then it means God says one thing, but he means a different thing. The issue with saying that it's a metaphor, a pure metaphor, is that you are saying God doesn't know how to say what he wants to say. But as we obviously know, it doesn't mean a bodily sitting. It's like, I'm sitting on my chair, then God sits on his throne. No, the two are not comparable. But if he says he sits on his throne, he is sitting in his throne in a way we can't comprehend. This is why the path of the Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, like Imam Shafi'i, is to say, nu'min bila kayf. Nu'min bila kayf. It's called bila kayf. This is the principle. The principle is bila kayf. Like, we know he has a hand, we know that he jogs, he smiles, he laughs, he sits on the throne, but we have no idea how he does that. But some of the Ash'aris, they try to answer this question and say, actually, like, his laughter is just as rida upon you. And someone like Muhammad Asad will say his sitting upon the throne is an isti'ara. It just means he seats himself on the seat of awesome power. Shaykh Al-Akbar does not agree. And I'm going to read back to you what was written in this passage in a second. He does not agree. If God says he's sitting, he is sitting, but we don't know how. So we do taslim. We just do taslim with our iman. We know he is sitting on the throne. We have no idea how. And then to go the wrong way, the other direction, is to say, oh yeah, he has a body in 6 dimensions. 6 like directions. He has like a physical 3-dimensional body, and he sits on the throne where you and I sit. We say that's also wrong, because that compromises on his awesome transcendence. Why is that wrong? Because we have textual requirements from the Quran that say laysa kamithli shay'un. There's nothing like him. You have to respect that principle for the interpretation of those ideas. By the way, this is going to blow your minds when we come to the section on laysa kamithli shay'un in this chapter. When we come to it, it's a key verse. But just for now, that's the basic meaning. So what the ulama say is that the correct way to interpret the verses on tashbih is that you say nu'min bila kayf, but viewed through the lens of tanzih. It inclines towards tanzih, which is to say, yes, he has a hand, but it's unlike any other hand that I know of. Yes, he smiles, but his smile is something I will never comprehend. I don't know how he does it, but he is doing it. It's something that does not enter into the field of our comprehension, our experience. Right? So now that we've done that, let's take it a step further. Tashbih is similarity, but it's in the Quran. Why do we have tashbih, which is extremely important? Just to confuse people? No. Tashbih is in the Quran because that's how you understand and relate to God. It tells you things about him. So is tanzih, right? But what's connected to tanzih is heba, right? That's where you feel heba with God. Where with tashbih, you feel uns. You can feel that connection, the warmth. This connection to God. That's how you get to know him. If I only talk about tanzih, you're talking about God I can't relate to. And if I only talk about tashbih and not tanzih, then I say things that aren't appropriate to God's majesty. So what is the requirement? To bring the two together to create a third way of understanding him. Chapter 3, number 3. That's why this chapter is number 3. Right? Pardon me just one second, please. Sorry about that. Thank you very much. Yeah. So let me see if there's anything else I just wanted to add to that very quickly. Right. So Subuhiyya is the wisdom. So this is the wisdom of Sayyid Nuh alayhi salam, right? This is his particular wisdom. He knows the wisdom of praise, of praising and exalting God and making him transcendent. The reason and purifying him. But as you'll see, there's more to this wisdom than what I'm saying. The reason he knows this wisdom is because every prophet brings to his people a particular sharia that suits their needs. So the people of Nuh, قوم Nuh, they were في غاية التشبيه. غاية التشبيه. They were in the extremity of tashbih, like in an extreme way. By the way, the extremity of tanzih is just atheism. Like if you just make God so transcendent that you can't know him or can't relate to him. If you do it in an extreme way, you just get no God, period, right? So the extremity of tashbih is just to have this multiplicity of gods, where you see the attributes multiplying throughout the cosmos all around you. You see all this divinity around you, but there's no way to tie it back to a single strand that brings them together, which is Tawheed. That is extreme tashbih. Thank you, Mina. That's exactly it. The Jabriyas say we have no free will. Yes, yes. Yeah, and of course, and then the Ash'ira say that free will is kasab, of course. Yes. Thank you very much, Kasbi. So if they were in the extremity of tashbih, what that means is that they require something that is equally extreme in the opposite direction to bring them back into balance. So Sayyid Nuh alayhi salam, he brought tanzih, and his people were they're drowning in the darkness of tashbih. So he brought the nur of tanzih, right? But he brought like a very strong tanzih to counteract their extreme tashbih, right? So that purification required rejecting their gods, right? But here's the thing, because there's no way to bring them together, his people ended up perishing. So that's why there's a report, there's a khabar that Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, after his people perished, he spent the rest of his life weeping. What does Nuh mean? The word nawwaha, nawwaha, what does that mean? It means the one who weeps. Nawwahi wa buka. It means al-buka. So he is called Nuh because he was constantly weeping and crying in sorrow over what happened to his people. And so the fuss, what you will come to see eventually, is that the fuss is an extraordinary cautionary tale of continuing the same path that he did, which was necessary for his people in his time. But in our time, Muhammad ﷺ, he does something else, right? Since we're now under the Sharia of Muhammad ﷺ, for this time till the end of time. So that's why he's called Nuh, the one who weeps. But he has a second name, and you're going to see this later on in the chapter. The Sheikh Al-Akbar doesn't mention it, but it's strongly implied. There is a tradition narrated by Imam Ja'afar Sadiq alayhi salam, who is the sixth Shia Imam, who says one of the names of Nuh alayhi salam is Abdul Ghaffar. Abdul Ghaffar. What does that mean? The servant of the one who forgives, right? But there's a second meaning to Ghafar, which is al-sitr. Ghafar يعني هو al-sitr, which means to cover over something. You'll see later on why that's so important. Now, why does he have the name Abdul Ghaffar? Because the Shaykh Al-Akbar mentions that the awliya and the anbiya too, they have, you can have any name you want, but when a wali ascends to a particular cosmic office, he's granted a title. So when the wali is the Qutb Zaman, he's called Abdullah. That's his title. Doesn't matter if he's called Abdullah in real life or not. His title becomes Abdullah. When a wali ascends to another level office, like he's the Imam of the left, he's called Abdul Malik. When he ascends to another office and he is in charge of the world of the spirits, he's called Abdul Rabb, for example, right? And so on and so forth. So he also held, say Nuh alayhi salam, he held a cosmic office, the office of Abdul Ghaffar. And so the meaning of Ghafar is al-sitr, which is the hijab, it's the veil. He's responsible for the veils that preserve the cosmos. And we'll see what that means later on. But his people, they perished because he could not compromise with them in any way whatsoever. But the Sharia of Muhammad does something else, and we'll see what that is. And the implications are extraordinary, because later on, the Shaykh Al-Akbar will go on to say that if Sayyid Nuh alayhi salam brought to his people what Rasulullah brought in terms of a verse of revelation, so this is like a Quranic ayah. If Sayyid Nuh alayhi salam brought something of a verse like what Muhammad brought in terms of revelation, they would have responded to him. Really ajib. They would have responded to him, which is an extraordinary claim. But I've kind of like gone off topic a little bit, so let's get back to the text. And then we'll call it a night, inshallah, at some point. علم أن التنزيه عند أهل حقائق في جانب الإلهية عين تحديد وتقييد. Know that transcendence or incomparability for the أهل حقائق. Who are the أهل حقائق? Who are they?
The Sufia. Those who
Yep.
know.
Yeah, but Sufia is too general. There's many kinds of Sufis. There are many kinds of Sufis who have a heart attack when they read the Fusus Al Hikam. I kid you not. It's not just Sufia. It's one higher than the Sufia. There's a certain group of Sufis. They're called the Muhaqqiqun, the verifiers. Muhaqqiqun, أهل حقائق. Muhaqqiqun, أهل حقائق. You can see the similarity. They are the ones who know the haqa'iq. They know the realities. Like they have direct ma'arifa, direct mystical knowledge of the realities. What the rational theologians, the mutakalimun, don't have. What the philosophers don't have. They have direct dhawq and tasting of. The janab ilahiyya, with regard to God, right? For them, tanzih is the same thing as tahdid wa taqeed. What is that? Tahdid it means to restrict something, but it's also definition. It's to encapsulate something in a definition. And taqeed is to imprison, is to enchain. It's like a chain. It's to imprison something and to restrict it. So the reason that mutakallimun stress God's tanzih so much, right? So it's the mutakallimun and the rational philosophers. So the rational mutakallimun and the rational philosophers, they tend to stress God's tanzih over his tashbih. Why? Because they want to purify him of things that are not appropriate to his majesty, the things that they consider not appropriate. But what happens when they do that? When they make God, so if you purify God, you're making him absolute. You say God is absolute. He's not like this or like that. Because if you compare him to something that's like this or like that, you've restricted him, right? You've made him relative. But guess what? The very act of making him transcendent is an act of tashbih itself. You have just done a tashbih yourself. It is the same thing. Making God absolute is the same thing as making him relative. Why is that?
Because the
extreme
absolute is from
polarity.
our imagination.
Sorry, one at a time, please.
Because you limited him complete. You've restricted him by saying he's absolutely, so that's a restriction.
Yes, absolutely. You have restricted him, especially to your own idea of what a proper definition is.
And you've made it impossible to experience him, or how can he be close to us like our jugular, his jugular vein? How is that then going to be possible? It's going to be impossible.
Yes.
According to their definition.
Yes, exactly. Well done. Yes, this is very true. And then someone else was saying something else as well. But yeah. Sorry, Khaled, go ahead.
Saying is the absolute holds in it, like, the other opposite, which is the polarity. So it takes him from one side to another.
But you know what? That's a good way of viewing absolute, because there's two ways to view the absolute. Absolute is saying something like God can't relate to his creation in any way whatsoever. That's the wrong way to view it. But the way you're saying it, Ghada, that's the good kind. We'll come to it in a second. Because what you just said, Ghada, Abu Sa'id al-Kharaz says that I've come to know God fi jama' al-adad. What does that mean? Fi jama' al-adad. I've come to know God by bringing together the opposites. This is when God is known. So well done, Ghada. That's like although you've anticipated something that we're coming to. That's the good kind of absolute. The wrong kind of absolute is when you say he's so absolute and nothing like his creation whatsoever in an extreme way, even to negate revelation, right? To the point that you negate revelation, that's just another restriction. You thought you were making him absolute. You just restricted him. That's the same thing. So the Ahl Haqa'iq, they know the Haqa'iq. That's why what they say makes sense. It's an extraordinary insight. So you can't just say he's absolute and it's all done and dusted. No. The one who does that, he's the munazzah, imma jahilun wa imma sahib su adab. Who wants to translate that? He's either, he doesn't know what he's talking about, so he's a jahil, he's ignorant, or he is exercising bad manners. Bad manners. Why is it bad manners?
Because among the manners is to honor what one is. And for example, if you restrict God in our case, actually you are actually dishonoring and disrespecting or not appreciating the reality as it is.
Good. Yes, you're right, Sidi. Good. But I'll add something to what you're saying. And it's something even simpler in addition to what you're saying. And it's that the Quran itself has tashbih. So you're contradicting the Quran. God has given you revelation in which he says, I have tashbih. So who are you to negate that? That's bad manners. Right? ولكن إذا أطلقاه someone was just saying something, but see, Petro, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I'm so sorry.
It's all right, but we'll come all the same. Okay. إذا أطلقاه وقال, if these two, when these two, they make God absolute, and وقال, they profess, right? وقال به, they believe in it, they profess in it, right? When one of them, فالقائل, the one who belongs to the divinely revealed laws and is a believer in them, فالقائل بالشرائع والمؤمن إذا, right? Sorry, بالشرائع المؤمن إذا نزه ووقف عند التنزيه ولم يرى غير ذلك فقد أساء الأدب, right? If all he sees is tanzih, when there's clearly tashbih in the Quran, then he has showed bad manners to God. That's bad manners. And the one who has bad manners to God, he will not teach you the spiritual realities, right? If he does tawqif, وقف عن التنزيه, if he just stops with it, وأكذب, and he gives the lie, وأكذب الحق والرسول صلوات الله عليهم, and he has given the lie to God and the messengers, peace be upon them all. Isn't that incredible? You've contradicted God and you've contradicted the messengers. Because the messengers, what do they bring? They bring tashbih, a way to understand God. But it just has to be done in an appropriate way, in a certain way. وَهُوَ لَا يَشْعُرُ, and he doesn't know that he's doing it, right? He's just kind of like puffed up in his chest and very proud. He's like, I just did a good thing. I'm pretty sure I got this right. And he didn't. ويتخيل, and he imagines أنه في الحاصل وهو في الفائت. He imagines that he obtained what was correct, but in fact it was wrong. It's actually erroneous. وهو كمان آمن ببعض وكفر ببعض, because there's a verse in the Quran that says the Ahlul Kitab, they believe in parts of the book, but they don't believe in the other part of the book. You're in the same level as them. You're doing the same thing. You're believing in parts of the Quran and you're disbelieving in parts of the Quran. That's really what you're doing. When you deny tashbih in the Quran, if you deny it totally, ولا سيما, especially, وقد علم, when it's known, أن ألسنة الشرائع الإلهية, right? The tongues with which the divinely revealed laws speak, إذا نطقت, they speak about God, right? إذا نطقت في الحق تعالى بما نطقت به, right? إنما جاءت به في العموم على مفهوم الأول. When the divinely revealed laws speak and they talk through the revelations, they speak to everyone. العموم على مفهوم الأول. What's the مفهوم الأول? The literal meaning of the verse. You see, people are afraid to look at the verses literally. Like, oh, if I take the hand of God literally, I'm doing kufr. No. God didn't say he has a bodily hand, just a hand. If you understand from that it's a bodily human hand, you're adding to the verse. He didn't say that. But it's a hand, but we don't know what hand it is. That's literalism, to stop where he stops, not to add to it. So the irony is that there are people called anthropomorphists, right? Maybe Mina can tell us about them as well. Sometimes they're the Hanabila, but sometimes it's not. Depends which Hanabila you're talking about. But the anthropomorphists believe that God has an actual physical body, right? And that causes problems and issues. But they're not reading the Quran literally. They are reading into it, adding to it what's not there. Because God never says in the Quran a bodily hand, a human way of walking. He doesn't say that. But he is using terms that we share. There's a connection between us by sharing the same words. And he's sharing those same words with us, thus establishing a kind of a connection. But the Shaykh al say, we don't know what the nisba is. We don't know what the connection is. Who knows the connection through ma'rifah? The awliya. And they tell you how, and they know how, if they want to tell you. They don't necessarily want to tell you, but they know how. They can see God's hand. They can see his running, his laughter. They can see it. But they know what it is. They know how it is. In what way? How? How exactly? We don't know. We may never know. But they know how it is.
So may I
Okay.
ask?
Just hold that thought. Let me finish this paragraph, and then please, you'll be the first person to ask me once we're done. But just like remind me. Okay. على مفهوم الأول وعلى الخصوص. So it brings both meanings, the meanings that are understood, the first apparent meaning of the verse, and على خصوص, right? على كل مفهوم يفهم من وجوه ذلك اللفظ, and any other understanding that can be understood in any aspect from those verses. If you're in my religious pluralism course, you'll know what that means, because there's a number of ways to read the Quran, a Quranic verse. But as long as it stays within the boundaries of the language, that interpretation is valid, right? So in the Arabic language, if we talk about the hand of God, in Arabic language, it means his power. This is correct, linguistically speaking. If you wanted to read it that way, that's not wrong, right? Because that is how the ancient Arabs say it. So as long as it adheres to the Arabic meaning, it's not a problem. But it's when you go outside of the Arabic, you get into issues. And it's when you deny al-mafhum al-awwal, you run into issues. بأي لسان كان. So that's for any revelation in Greek, Hebrew, Sanskrit, whatever it is. بأي لسان كان في وضع ذلك لسان, in the وضع, which is the way those people say it. Right? That is the revelation that the prophets universally bring. They bring that revelation. They don't bring elitist revelation where you write in riddles and it takes someone very knowledgeable to decipher what those riddles mean. That's not the language they bring. They bring a language which is على مفهوم الأول. And then بعد المفهوم الأول, there's oceans of different interpretations, oceans of meanings. But the مفهوم الأول always stays. You don't disregard it. You don't throw it away, right? So we're already into the first duality, which is tanzih and tashbih. You are going to come into the second duality at some point, which is Quran versus Furqan, right? And we're going to save that for next time, because I don't know if I want to, yeah, we'll do the second paragraph next time. But we'll get into the next duality, which is Quran and Furqan, right? What is Quran and what is Furqan? We'll spend about 5 minutes on this and then we'll end the session. Quran is the revelation of Quran, right? What's Furqan? Furqan is any one of the past revelations that came down to previous prophets, like the revelation of the Injil and the Torah, for example. That's called Furqan. What's the second meaning of Quran? So revelation is one meaning. What's the second meaning of Quran?
Gathering.
Gathering. Yes, absolutely. And so at some point, the Shaykh al-Akbar will talk about how one of the meanings of Quran is to gather your himma to achieve something, which is like a form of manifestation. The third meaning of Quran is to gather the realities into one place. It's to gather the realities, jama' al-haqa'iq, right? Because one of the root meanings of Quran, qara'a with a hamza, doesn't just mean to read. It means to gather things, like qaratu shay bi shay. I gathered one thing onto the other. I brought them together. It means jama'. So what he will say eventually is that Qawm Nuh, they were in a state of, or the maqam actually, they were in a station of jama'. They were in a station of Quran. Whereas Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, he was in a station of Furqan, of separation. What does that mean? We will come to that at some point in the future, inshallah, which is connected to everything we've been talking about so far. Now, I'll just add one final point. The brilliant commentator, he's a Gujarati commentator, he's called Mahaimi. He's a brilliant Gujarati commentator, but he wrote it in Arabic. He says, look, the issue with denying God's tashbih and only focusing on what God isn't. He isn't like his creation. He isn't, let's say, forgetful, and he isn't impetuous like we are, and he doesn't sin, and he doesn't do this and that. You think that writing these lists of what he doesn't do, doesn't, that's a way of worshiping him. That's a way of praising him. Mahatmi says, no, this is what you sound like. He says you're believing in something called the Aqidat al-Sultan, the belief of the Sultan, literally the ruler of a country. Like in the old days, if you're a poet, you have to write praise poetry to a Sultan if you wanted to get money. Like if you're someone like Al-Mutanabbi, this was your profession. You wrote praise poetry for the Sultan, and in return, he would grant you his favors and his money and cash and his patronage. So he says, that's the same thing as a poet going up to a sultan and saying, Ya Sultan, أنت لست بفأر ولا حمار ولا كلب. Who wants to translate that?
Well, I know the bits about him not being a donkey and you're not a cat dog, but that's not very complimentary.
So imagine you go to the Sultan and you say, here's my praise poem. You're not a donkey, you're not a rat, and you're not a dog. That's not a very good praise poem, is it? He'll probably execute you on the spot, right? Because that doesn't tell you anything about his good qualities. Whereas tashbih tells you about his good qualities, right? Tashbih gets to the heart of the matter and allows you to connect to God. Whereas tanzih disconnects you from God. And they're both important. You have to have both of them in balance. So that's why it's called bad manners. Su' al-adab. And he's not kidding. So we'll just leave it there. We'll start with Sayyid Bukhari because he had a question, and then I'll take other questions too.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, my first question was that when the discussion was taking place between that you better ask, Ahlul Haqaiq, right? Now the
Yes.
Ahlul Haqaiq and the literalist, if I may say literalist. So I was just wondering that, for example, if the literalists do not know anything from the Ahlul Haqaiq perspective, so how does that dialogue takes place? Because what I am stuck in, that Ahlul Haqaiq try to go beyond, linguistic restrictions and try to get the deeper meanings, right? So
No. The Ahlul Haqaiq stick to the text. They stick to the linguistic text. They're not literalists. They're people of perfection. What does perfection mean? It means completion. What is completion? They bring together tanzih with tashbih. That becomes kamal. Those are the Ahl al-Haqaiq. That's what they are.
No, I understand that. I understand that they're
Okay.
literally different from the Ahlul Haqaiq. But I was just wondering, how do they communicate with each other? For example, if a philosopher claims something that like tanzih, and it means that something. Now, for example, if they understand that, how will Ahlul Haqaiq, and let us take the example of Imam Ghazali. How is, when he talks about that Ahlul Zawq have the better and deeper understanding of the reality is, and how would he put in a position to make, let's say, Avicenna understand or Al-Farabi understand what you were missing? So this was the question that was popping up in my mind when you were explaining the first paragraph.
He tells them that you guys are too much on the side of tanzih. You have to come back and understand tashbih a little bit. They're too far on the side of tashbih. They're too far on the side of tanzih, and that's not very good manners to only be in tanzih. You have to acknowledge God's tashbih. So actually, by the way, did you know that Ibn Arabi wrote to Fakhr ad-Din Razi?
No, not unfortunately.
Oh yes. Ibn Arabi wrote to Fakhr ad-Din Razi. And he was kind of like critiquing him for being so stuck in Kalam. And said, listen, brother, what are you doing just rationalizing all this stuff? You're in the deep pit of rationalization. Come out of it. Do some riyada. What's riyada? Spiritual exercises.
Yes.
Spiritual struggles. Do some spiritual exercises. Do some dhikr. You'll see the haqa'iq for yourself. It's a brilliant letter. It's available on the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society website if you want to read it.
Thank you. And can you explain a bit kalima, the word meaning, the meaning of the kalima, right top on the title?
Oh, I
Kalima.
see. Okay. Right. The kalima and the kilma, they are the anbiya. They are the anbiya that, now, technically speaking, every object in the universe is a word of God. Every object in the universe is a word of God. But they're not necessarily given the title of kalimat, right? So for example, Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, he has the title called wa kalimatuhu, and he's the word of God. So is everything else, but he gets that title because he is distinguished from other prophets by that title. Similarly, the prophets are distinguished from the ordinary people by being called the words of God. So it just means the prophets in this example, right? But there's more to say about it. You're right. You've raised a good point. If I look into the commentaries, I can maybe give you more information. But you're right. There's more to say about that. Because the idea is that the prophetic wisdom is one, but it comes in different molds and shapes. Right? That's the point of the title. And we can get into that more into that later. There's a lot to say about the word fussus as well. The bezel of wisdom, the ring stone. Why is it a certain shape? Right? So let's do that later, inshallah, at some point. But thanks for your question, CD. Yeah, okay. Next question. And Musa Kalimullah as well. Yes. He is the one God spoke to. Exactly. That's his title. Thank you. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course. Bismillah.
It's not a question, actually. It's trying to understand. For example, you say أهل الكلام,
متكلمون.
المتكلمون. So they are into tanzih. And then when Ibn Arabi said do some exercise, which is spiritual exercise, it means a flexibility. So I'm trying to understand where they come from, al-mutakallimun. They come from a place they're afraid to shirk fillah. That's why they bring him to tanzih. Or if they come from a place of rigidity that we know.
It comes from a place of partly fear of saying and talking about God what is not appropriate for him, what's not appropriate for him. And for them, what's not appropriate for God is to give him any connection to creation. That's not appropriate. So they try to show you how there's no connection between him and his creation, which causes other issues, right? But also what they do is, historically, they are given the task of dialoguing with other religions and other sects and other philosophies especially, in order to defend the religion. So they had a certain purpose. Because what would happen is that as Islam expanded, they would start coming across Buddhist philosophy, Greek philosophy especially, Hellenistic philosophy, and those would pose serious challenges to the religion. So it was their job to formulate a way of answering those philosophies and dealing with those other religions, right? In order to protect Islam. That was their job. It was a defensive job.
So by them doing this as a defensive job, was it giving the purpose? Was it feeding the purpose or no?
Was it achieving the purpose of defending the religion?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. No, they did a pretty good job. It just brought other problems. Like in the wider economy, every person had a role to play. So they played their role. You know, Sheikh Al-Akbar does not criticize you for being who you are. If be a mutakallim, be a philosopher, philosoph, be a faqih, be muhaddith, be whatever you are. He doesn't care, because we all have a role to play. We should be who we are, okay? His issue is two things. One, we don't need that many mutakallimun in his time, he says. He says, look, one mutakallim per country is enough for me. That's Ibn Arabi. I think in our day and age, we need a bit more, because we face more challenges. But in his time, he said, one mutakallim per country, no more. So you don't need to waste time going into something that doesn't really get to the heart of what religion is about. The second issue with kalam is sometimes you try to talk about things that's none of your business, like trying to give a definition to God. Like there's certain things you can say about God, which is correct. But beyond that, it's called هذا الشيء فوق طور العقل. فوق طور العقل. It's beyond the level, the stage of reason. So it's not the business of our rational intelligence to start talking about what we don't understand. That's now the business of the awliya and the arifun and the ulama billah and the awliya. That's their business, right? So that what happens is that sometimes they will say something about God and they'll bring news and khabar from God. And then a mutakallim will say, no, that's impossible. That's kufr. And they'll say, no, it's not. And now you're accusing us of something that we brought, which is holy, and you're calling it kufr. So sometimes they step beyond their allotted role and go into things which is none of their business. That's the second criticism of them. But if you stick to what you're supposed to do, and you know where the boundaries of reason are, what are the boundaries? You stick to the boundaries of what you know and can't know, you're fine. There's no blame on you. Mina, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a little comment and reflection about متكلمون. I think, of course, Sidi Muhyiddin's critique of علم الكلام is well put, and it's not only, I'm not the one who would say if it's well put or not, but what I'm trying to say is that most عارفين have the same also viewpoint and Sufi inclinations towards, for example, calling توحيد أو حالة توحيد, and in Sidi Abd Salam al-Mashish's دعاء that, oh God, take me out of أو حالة توحيد, which is those conundrums or questions that relate to تنزيه or تشبيه and all of so. But at the same time, I have to say that I found علم الكلام a beautiful discipline, and studying it, especially the Ash'ari madhab, and I know Fakhr al-Din al-Razi is the Imam of Ash'ari, but I think that the kinds of debates that happened between Sidi Muhyiddin, I might be wrong, that between Sidi Muhyiddin and Fakhr al-Din al-Razi were very, very high level. In terms of spiritual gnosis and understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and all of the other theological aspects, but also a lot of Sufis, like for example Al-Imam al-Dardir, who was the Shaykh of the Khalwati Tariqa, and he was Shaykh al-Azhar, and at the same time he was the Shaykh of Malikis and the Shaykh of he wrote Al-Kharid al-Bahiyya in Ilm al-Kalam, and it's a very, very basic text for people to understand the basics of Islamic theology, and it has the same principles of being rational or focusing on rationality and logic, and at the same time revelation. So I'm just trying to say that I think it's a very noble discipline nonetheless, and
Yes.
And there's a
Yes.
lot of debate, even antiquate debate يعني around whether or not it's halal to study kalam. But I think most scholars
Yes.
in our time think it is actually not a bad idea. It's a wonderful field of study, but for spiritual purposes, it's important to know that that there is what's beyond as well, beyond the ilm al-kalam, in terms of ذوق. And
Mina, thank you so much for saying that. And I apologize if I was giving Kalam a bad name by only critiquing it and talking about its
no, not
criticisms.
at all. Yeah.
Like it's a very important discipline. And like, like I think it would really help us if in the chat room you told us like what is the purpose of Kalam? Because I know I call it a defensive discipline, but there's more to it than that. Because it also gives structure to some of the more rational questions in our religion, some of the more rational issues. It gives them like a good structure. And it does other things as well. If you could just write in the chat room, like, what are some of the important uses of kalam, like, I'd be really grateful because it is important, as you said. And just like, Allah barak fiki for just bringing that up. Thank you so much.
Absolutely, I would love to do that. On the chat box, you mean on the...
WhatsApp, yeah.
On WhatsApp, yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'll make it a task.
Yeah. Otherwise, I'm just doing a little to kalam, and that's not fair. Okay, thank you so much. Hannah, please.
Yeah, that made me think of the the whole thing about Sharia and tasawwuf. Yeah,
Yes.
like you say. So they're the same kind of separation, isn't it? So you've got your kalam, your discipline, your rules,
Yes.
your regulations, and then on the other side you have to have the riyada, the spiritual practice to maintain the heart, and that seemed to be like the comparison there. Inshallah.
Yeah, so you should definitely, like, you have to have a balance between all the disciplines, right? But you don't even need to be that spiritual. Like, maybe your mutakallim, for example, is not very spiritually talented. That's not his fault, okay? So let him be a mutakallim. The only issue is if he starts to go beyond, right, and talk about things that aren't any of his business, then we run into problems. But if he sticks to his role, he's totally fine. And if you are someone, sorry, and if you're someone who can do all the disciplines, do them.
Would you put Wahhabis in that mutakallimun side, or is it something slightly different altogether? Or do they have a tendency that way?
No, because Wahhabism rejects these kinds of studies of logic and philosophy and stuff like that. They just reject it. I have not studied Wahhabism enough to know really for certain what they do and what they don't do. But my understanding is that they really reject these disciplines of kalam. Because if you engage with proper kalam, you don't end up making the mistakes that they make. So kalam is actually a very important discipline, especially in our day and age, for lots of reasons. Like, I think like there's lots of good brothers. They use kalam to dialogue with science today, which is really important. Like, how do you bring modern science into dialogue with our religion? It's through kalam. Kalam is the proper tool for that. And so those brothers are doing like a really great service to us by doing that, for example. You're most welcome. Good question, Ghada. I will not spoil it. You will see later on. I don't want to spoil it. But that's a great question. What comes if you bring tanzih and tashweet together? What do you get? We will find out, inshallah. I'll take a last question, and then we'll call it a night, inshallah. All right, that's good. Let's just stop the recording there then.